reason why so much science fiction is infantile is because the characters are not complex. They can't afford to be complex, so it's perfectly fair to make them adolescents. But as you become interested in character, in individuals, in creating individuals and putting them in specific situations, you gradually lose the science fiction element.
You know, he's really, he's shameless in intellectual argument. He's absolutely without character, a moral foundation, or even intellectual substance.
To the Getting Lit podcast. Last week we talked about J.M. Coetzee's Disgrace, and now we're going in quite a different direction, and we're talking about the work of Michael Moorcock, specifically the first book in his Corum series, which is The Knight of the Swords. And we are joined once again by Yeerk. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back on Getting Lit.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you back. So this came about because I think Fresta got this book, right? And then we were like, oh, yeah, we should do it. And then we worked out that Yeerk was a big Moorcock fan, so...
Yeah, you just asked me for like some short books we could punch out real quick, and I just gave you a list of anything that looked short. And then I know I'd heard Yeerk mentioned, was probably one of the only people I've heard mention Michael Moorcock on podcasts. So I was like, oh, Yeerk. He'd be a good guest, I'm sure.
Yeah. He's always a good guest and always welcome, of course. But yeah, Moorcock is pretty funny. It's like in no other podcast are you going to get J.M. Coetzee one week and then Michael Moorcock the next. I'm just putting that out there. So Michael Moorcock, he's great. I love him. He is like one of the key writers in the new wave of science fiction. And I've done a couple of writers from this sort of movement before, but they've mostly been American, I think. And in some ways, I think the new wave kind of started in Britain, specifically around New Worlds, which was when, and around the time in the early 60s when Moorcock was actually editing it. So I thought, who better to sort of talk about if we're going to talk about some kind of classic science fiction. But it's not quite classic. It's sort of a reinterpretation of a lot of science fiction and sword and sorcery and stuff like that. But first of all, I just want to go through, Yeerk, what's your history with Michael Moorcock?
Oh man, it's a bit elaborate because he's always been one of my favorite writers. I think I was probably introduced to him through like a cameo of his character Jerry Cornelius in The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, The Black Dossier by Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill, which is this series I'm obsessed with, and I bring it up on my show like 24/7. I'm kind of trying to make like The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and Pere Ubu my show's equivalent of like Jack's soap operas on Perfume Nationalist. Because it's just this like endless reference point that threads through everything, because it introduced me to so many pieces of literature, like Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman, in Watermelon Sugar by Richard Brautigan. What else? William Hope Hodgson, so many kind of writers and books that I really, really love. In The Black Dossier, the characters it's set in 1950s Britain. They stay at this guest house run by Mrs. Cornelius, Jerry Cornelius's mother. And we see Jerry as a child. But he's also talking about having like shot his brother Frank. or Catherine Cornelius, his sister, with whom Jerry has like an incestuous relationship. This is getting ahead of, but like says, she's a child in this comic, but she's like says to Mrs. Cornelius, the mother, like, Frank was doing me, then Jerry shot him with something, and now we think he's dead. And I was like, it was one of these things that I was really confused by, because I was like, what is happening in this situation? There's like this illusion, like these are children, but is that like a distressing illusion to like incestuous sex between them, and then one of them's been shot with another thing and he's dead again. It was just like a really strange, I was like, what is going on here? And I used to obsessively read Jess Nevin's League annotations where he'd pour through all the references. And so, I mean, if people don't know, this is like a world where all fiction is true. And Alan Moore and Michael Moorcock are friends, so they would, Moore would put a lot of Moorcock references into things. And then later on, we have Zenith the Albino, who's basically also Elric, showing up in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen Volume 4. By that point, I was, like, well familiar with all of these characters. But, so I was first introduced to Moorcock through this, like, incredibly exciting and mysterious paragraph describing the character of Jerry Cornelius on Jess Nevin's annotations website, and it just was the most like insane, trippy, postmodern kind of spy character, but it had this streak of kind of like Dadaism running through it or something. And then everything that I had found out more about Jerry Cornelius, this character, sounded more kind of fascinating and mysterious. And reading about him on that series on Wikipedia introduced me to Elric and to the ideas of the Eternal Champion and so on. And then later, I came across the Galan's Fantasy Masterworks edition of Elric, which collects a random bunch of stories, like The Stealer of Souls, and I think the short novel Stormbringer is in there as well. I found that in a bookshop in Wales, and I bought it, and I remember being so thrilled to have found a book by Michael Moorcock. It felt so kind of exciting. And I read through those, and it felt really, really good to cross the threshold into this kind of like, implicitly embarrassing or like uncool, like just like pure fantasy style, which felt like it had come from like another universe. And then I remember on a family holiday somewhere, like a seaside holiday, I found this secondhand bookshop, and they had like a whole series of Michael Moorcock paperbacks, from back in the day, which I mistook as being something incredibly valuable, but actually, they will show up all the time in like an Oxfam sci-fi section or whatever. But at the time, I was, these were like, they were like vibrating with value. And I bought maybe
Are they the ones with the pale covers with like his surname just really large font at the top? Are they those ones, or?
I do have some of those, but these ones were like the tiny little shitty paperbacks that were like falling apart. And I bought maybe like 9 of those or something, and I just bought like a random handful. And obviously, he has written so many books, and there are so many versions of all of his books, and they keep trying to create these new like canonical series that will collect them all, but they always leave out some little bits and pieces or whatever. I just bought a random handful, and one of them was the first book of the second Corum trilogy, The Bull and the Spear, which was drawing from all this kind of, British mythology, or kind of Irish mythology. And I really, really loved it. And since then, I dipped my toe into random places. I've read a bunch of the Hawkmoon books. I've read a bunch of Jerry Cornelius short stories, and I read through the novels at one point. I've read the first book of his Pyatt Quartet, which is incredible, and I've read his like some of his literary fiction. I mean, Pyatt Quartet is literary fiction, but also Mother London, which is a really, really wonderful, beautiful novel, incredibly well written. So I haven't read all of it, but I've read a good random chunk of it. We'll talk about it, but he just remains one of my favorite fantasy writers, almost because he has this kind of like workman-like, almost like Dickensian approach to writing fiction, where he's really not precious about it. And there is something that's so sort of like pleasurably generic about his fantasy writing in particular that I really enjoy. And I also think that his sort of like workman-like attitude towards writing has actually resulted in a really kind of satisfying and vivid, entertaining prose style that I always enjoy how kind of colorful and vivid it is,
I think one of the things with his work, because he's got this, like, this is something we can get into, but he's got this idea in his work about like, multiple planes of reality and like this constant struggle between, chaos and order, and, there being like people on the sides of chaos, people on the sides of law or order, and various gods and things like that. And this kind of echoes throughout different planes of reality and stuff. And that's his sort of kind of overarching mythos, and which includes the eternal champion, which is someone who is either fights for chaos or law and is there to sort of tip the balance, keep things balanced so one doesn't, overcome the other. That's sort of like his overarching thing. And then within that, he just sort of like, he just cooks, and that's why he can be very workmanlike, because I'm pretty sure I don't think every story he writes is under that sort of rubric, but definitely that is like a thing that is sort of, cast, I don't want to say cast the pall, but sort of is overarching the entire thing. And within that, he can do so much, and I don't think he worries too much in the same way that other fantasy and science fiction writers who are writing linear series do. It's like, you've got to have these histories and like cultures all mapped out in a way. But he just sort of, because he's got that thing that's kind of sort of remote and distant, that kind of mythos, he just plays rather than like gets really exact and linear.
He's not precious about it, which I think is very refreshing.
Often rewrites it, like you said as well. Like he just rewrites things as like reissues. Yeah, and
he'll do things like he'll retroactively write books into his universe when they're reprinted by changing a character's name so that it sounds like a name derived from Beck, which means the character is like a relative of the character Von Beck or something. Like, he'll do this kind of thing all the time, or he'll just like make a character, like give a character's name, a sort of Jerry Cornelius derived name, like Jerry Cornell or Jarek Carnelian, or I've read the Dances at the End of Time as well, which is one of his kind of sci-fi series, but. Yeah, you actually see it in this book, and you see it in Elric too. He also has this kind of like, very like Edwardian, well, Victorian to Edwardian literary sensibility, that includes a deep appreciation of fantasy Eklar writers and people like Oscar Wilde, and then from later on, Ronald Furbank, who I discovered through Moorcock's appreciation of him and his references to him, and then became a massive literary enthusiasm on my part. So you see that kind of like fantasy Eklar concern, which often bleeds into the sort of like existentialist romance of the Elric character, because a lot of his heroes are kind of doomed. And when you're a teenager and you want something that is I don't want to piss everybody off because I have no particular like negative feelings towards Tolkien, but when you're a teenager and you want something that's a little bit like edgier, Moorcock is a good alternative because, his cosmology replaces good and evil with order and chaos, which when you're a teenager seems really, really like sick and sophisticated. But, for me, it also sort of chimed with various other kind of countercultural obsessions and romances that I had with like Discordianism and Robert Anton Wilson and, it was like Moorcock describing himself as like a anarchist and a pragmatist was really cool to me as a teenager. And this is all kind of like, he's kind of nominally leftist, but this is kind of like pre-woke, and I don't know. I remain interested in all his like those New Worlds associated writers, and they actually kind of remain interesting politically too. Like they don't always have the views you would assume they'd have.
It's kind of like vaguely left wing, but also kind of slightly libertarian as well, in that they privilege like the individual as like a nexus of expression and power and things like that, like the individual against the world sort of thing. Like Elric's a good, so is Corum actually. Like he's literally, when we go into talk about the story, is literally like the last of his kind, and which is a common trope, but like the way that he writes it is very much like his individuation is part of the process of the story.
I love the way that his most generic fiction, which I would consider to be the Corum books, the Hawkmoon books, Ericos, and Elric, where he's just writing pretty much straightforward fantasy. I love how sparsely populated the worlds are, and how he makes utterly no attempt to sort of like create an impression of a sort of functioning society in any way. In contrast to somebody like George R. R. Martin, who's like bringing this kind of realist mode to fantasy writing. I really love that Moorcock actually stays on this like mythic plane where there'll always be a castle that's inhabited by like 15 people in a wilderness, and it's just a sort of self-sustaining community, and then one of them will ride out and just be riding for days through forest, and then he'll have like an enemy encounter, and that will go one way or another. But then, and it's all just like he has some kind of magical object he needs to find within a specific time frame. And then he'll just have these various like psychedelic encounters on the way. But it's all occurring like purely at the level of a kind of like romance with a capital R,
and he's clearly very influenced by, the romantics. Like lots of his characters are very Byronic, like in there, because like Corum himself as well is this sort of like, I don't want to say warrior poet, because he kind of learns to be a warrior, because like he sort of gets some training in his like 15-person castle, but it's never like applied training. It's just like, we used to do this sort of thing.
It's like he learned the art of war rather than like had to learn it as like something he needed.
Yeah, but it seemed like this idyllic place where his people lived in this castle, and these people are sort of scattered around, all in like little castles, little kind of family groups in castles across the land. But yeah, he's sort of this. There are people who appreciate beauty and rationality and all this stuff, and he sort of thrusts into the conflict, avenges his people, becomes a warrior sort of thing. So it's like this, there is something romantic about it, and that level at which it operates too. I think that's a really good point, because comparing this to something like Tolkien or even George R. R. Martin, who in some ways, is reacting against Tolkien as well by like it's part of his main raison d'etre for the series, the Song of Ice and Fire, where he's like, there's that common quote attributed to him where he's like, yeah, but what was Aragon's tax policy? And like, my answer to that is, who the fuck cares? Like, I don't care what Aragon's tax policy was. Like, you
know what? I would actually be into that, but only if it was like super, super boring.
Yes. Yeah.
Even if it was like insanely bureaucratic, but it just took place in like a fantasy setting.
Yeah.
And there was almost no violence, and it was like this extremely dry tale of like political corruption or something, but no one really gets killed. It's just like various scandals emerging.
Yeah,
that would actually be really cool and interesting.
Yeah.
I would
like
love that.
1,000 pages minimum for like every book. Yeah, and it's just
Just these
it's just like just whole chapters of tax code. Like...
Just as some kind of like insane world building project. I think that would be really sick. Like,
but that's what I imagine Dune is like. I mean, I've never read it, but I just imagine it's lots of like the hierarchies of the like interdimensional like aristocracy or whatever's going on in that series. So I don't know. That's kind of why I've never actually read it yet. I just thought it was like lots of tax code stuff.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of that in Dune, but like the with all the princes and court counts and things like that. But I wanted to say as well that Moorcock it's sort of a more free kind of mythic romantic register, whereas I think the problem with people like Martin and various I haven't read modern fantasy for like years basically. I think probably Martin was the last big one that I read, but like I think the problem is that like they take the genre of fantasy and they kind of science fictionalize it, because like science fiction is all about like the details, the autistic
mechanics,
the mechanics of like and I don't think fantasy stories in the classic kind of mode of that is very, very much influenced by romanticism needs to operate on that level. We don't really need to Martin goes into pages and pages of details of like feasts, which is like, who cares? Just say there was like a big pie. Like, why do you have to like?
Moorcock does have some good like passages describing food, and like there's a good like little Christmas Jerry Cornelius story where he's describing like a Christmas market in this kind of Dickensian splendor, which is really fun. But yeah, like there's all the kind of like fantastic elements that populate his worlds feel so kind of like thrown out, just like thrown out there, but kind of in a good way. Like I like that about them. I like that they don't have this like feeling of like indigestible weight like weighing down the narrative. And in this book is a perfect example because he's just like throwing up new lands and peoples as he kind of thinks of them, as the story requires them, as you go along. And it's exactly like the kind of level of reality that I like in this kind of fiction, right? Where it will just be like the land of Nagalaboth is over here. I just love that kind of like almost improvisational quality to it, where
it's like,
he just
oh, sorry, I was saying, it's kind of reminds me of like Diablo, the video game. Like you just enter a dungeon and then it auto generates and just fills it full of like whatever. Like it's not like he's mapped it out beforehand. Whereas imagine Tolkien and Martin and all that do actually draw the maps first before writing the book. So yeah, I like that where it's just like, it's just like you just fly north or whatever and you go through some psychedelic land, and then beyond that there's a different psychedelic land.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's really appealing because the sort of like mechanism of imaginative production is really like close to the surface narratively. And I remember him talking about like there's this out of print book that was published by this Manchester independent publishing company called Savoy, that he wrote called Death is No Obstacle, which is basically his guide to writing fantastic fiction. And he basically has this formula where it's like, oh, you have so many words, you divide them into a certain number, like something has to happen on page 3 of each of these like segments. The hero has to be searching for like an object of some kind, and there has to be like a time limit. And that's like roughly the formula. And he would just like churn these things out in Ladbroke Grove, in in Notting Hill in London, in the 70s, just like on speed. And he'd like write them in like 3 days, so he was just like churning this kind of stuff out. And he'd be drawing on like, I think in the Hawkmoon series, like there are 4 kind of gods or kings or something, but their names are just kind of garbled versions of the names of the Beatles.
Yes, I read that. I haven't read that series, but I read that and I love that little detail.
Yeah.
Because that's like that series is about like it's a post-apocalyptic, but sort of there's magic and stuff, and
it's set in Gran Breton, which is a sort of like fantasticalization of Great Britain, which is this other kind of thing that he does where he plays with these like shifting and overlapping worlds, which is really fun. And the multiverse thing, the way that all of his fiction is contained in this overarching narrative, it seems really kind of like mysterious and engrossing when you're younger. I think now it's kind of like it's like a sort of trick that he uses in order to give a sense of like depth to all of these stories, by kind of having them all like overlap in different realms. But yeah, I mean, it's it's just kind of like fun. I love this feeling of like there is always like an intimation of another layer of something going on that you'll never quite get to the bottom of. So there's always this kind of perpetual interest to keep you reading.
Yeah, and it's very different to the way that, like, because in some ways he pioneered the idea of the fictional multiverse, right? But it's kind of been used to death now, like with, superhero comics and the movies and stuff like that, but it's kind of, I love that you said it's almost like folding in, or like, they're intersecting in various different ways. But whereas the other ones are sort of like just parallel worlds that they can mine for like different interpretations on the same characters, whereas he's actually making different characters who are sort of like echo aspects of the other, even if it's just like names or like certain
these resonances, reverberations of the other characters, which kind of build up an associative significance. So if we encounter a character in the Corum books who has a sort of like one of these Jerry Cornelius names, if we know who Jerry Cornelius is and we recognize that sort of like patterning, then we have a sense of what this character's like status is within the overall Moorcockian cosmology. And then sometimes you feel like he's just exploiting that in a slightly cheap way, which I think, he has every right to do. I mean, I don't, it doesn't bother me. But it's just a nice effect that he gets through doing this.
Well, Corum himself, like his full name, Corum Jalen Ursay, it's very close anagram to Jerry Cornelius. Like if you look at all the letters in it. Yeah.
I think that is where he got the name from.
Yeah. So he does little things like that.
It's like they're like emanations across just different dimensions. It's like the object exists across all dimensions, and then you just get to peer at it from whichever like dimension he's set the story in, kind of thing. And it's like, it has this like ideal form that you get different aspects. Not that I've read much of his stuff, but like just from what you guys are saying, it sounds like that.
No, totally. I mean, it also establishes the overarching kind of cosmic irony of the whole series, which is that even the heroic characters are always kind of pawns in this larger struggle between order and chaos. And often find that like their personal quest, what they believe is their own agency is kind of later revealed to be some kind of like cosmic conspiracy that's actually a sort of movement within this grand game between these two cosmic forces. So that, adds a lot to the kind of like tragic element of characters like Elric and Corum.
Definitely. But I think that the rules of the world, so to speak, or the multiverse, is that the eternal champion usually has to be mortal, right? And is the only kind of person in the world who can balance things. But then, of course, they get kind of, like you say, these cosmic conspiracies where they're getting nudged in certain ways to balance things in the way that's favorable to the powers that be or whatever, which is a nice little touch, I think.
And it's also nice that, like, depending on who the character is and what, like, plane they're in of the multiverse, they could be fighting on behalf of order or chaos. So this one character, divided between all these different realms, will, depending on what realm they're in, maybe on kind of opposing sides, but within their own kind of cosmic niche, like, they are ultimately working for the same purpose, which is the balance of these forces.
Yeah, that's something that it's there's obviously a kind of nod to Discordianism, like you said earlier. Like, I like how in this first book of the Corum series, when he goes into the Chaos God's castle and he sees the symbol, like this Discordian symbol.
I think that he created that. I think it's the other way
Really?
around, where they borrowed it from him. Well, the UK Chaos Magicians definitely borrowed the symbol of chaos from him.
Oh, interesting.
Like the circle with the arrow, 8 arrows, in directions. And what's an order is just like one arrow in one direction kind of thing.
Yeah. And you see that like logo everywhere now. It's just like freely appropriated. In like video games or whatever.
Infographics and stuff like that. But yeah, so Corum is a series of I think there's in the first series there's 3 books, and in the second is there 3 or is there 4? I can't remember.
I can't remember either.
Yeah. But
In
basically,
the books I have, it says 3 and 3, but then maybe it seems like there might have been ones added later.
yeah,
So
like we were saying before, you never know with him. Because
Yeah.
like he might just add a book or rewrite something or whatever. So basically, Corum is like I guess you would say a prince. He's part of I can never pronounce this, the Vadach, which is this like group of people that are sort of, they're not quite human, but they're not like they're not non-human either. Again, this is part of his mythic resonance, right? Like it's not very solid in terms of what they actually are.
Leaves it open what the like chief differences are. I think they're kind of like vaguely elfin. Like they've all got like they're all tall with like tall thin faces,
purple eyes,
paler skin.
Yeah. These people live in these kind of dislocated castles where there's these small family groups in all of them. Basically in this first story, his father sends him out. I can't even remember the inciting incident why his father sends him out.
Because his father's says he's like gonna like basically suicide pod himself soon, like go into the Hall of Vapors, and he's saying like, I want to find out what's happened to the other families of our race, because it's been like 200 years since we've even communicated. Like there was all these wars in the past between the Nardrag and the Vardag, and then they all sort of just isolated and got like lost in abstractions and like thinking about like literary and artistic ideas. And then so he says like, before I die, I'd like to find out what's happened to all these people. And also they're saying that they're having trouble accessing the other planes of reality, like their occult powers are dwindling. So he sort of wants to find out what's going on with that. And so that's why he sends him out.
And then Corum sort of discovers that what's the Mabden, which are basically humans, men, are kind of just running rampant across the land, and they're really violent and sadistic. And he works out that they basically systematically killed all of his people, and then he realizes that there's one only one castle left, and basically they've already invaded it and killed his family, and then they capture him and torture him. What I really liked about the Mabden too is that I remember reading somewhere like years ago about like, you know, when people just put out ideas that would be good for like stories or something like that.
Yeah.
There was one that I read, a post where it was like, you know, there's heaps of alien invasion stories and stuff like that, but someone should do like a space opera or something where like the humans are like the evil aliens because, you know, they're sadistic and all this sort of shit. Very like dark view of humanity. But like, I was like, well, I was reading this and it's like, that's already happened. He's already done this. I love how he like the way he frames humanity in this way. But then also it's not all bad as well, because there are actually kind of a sect, I guess, of the Mabden who are a little bit more civilized, I guess you would say. And I kind of liked that touch that he made humans into this like these bestial kind of people.
They're like orcs kind of.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the only like leftisy kind of thing of the book, is maybe a little bit of misanthropy, but then it sort of is also like sort of doesn't go like full just humans are scum kind of thing. It's just more like
it touches on the like whole like humans are a virus kind of thing. But then I think that he's slightly too sophisticated for that.
Yeah.
And then it's also part of his kind of like part of the way his like politics will inflect his work that I like is actually also how sort of straightforward and simple and didactic he can be. And there's a sort of touch of that with this, where Corum like very straightforwardly learns the lesson that you shouldn't like generalize about humans because some of them are good. And I like how sort of like simply and cleanly that sort of like folded into his narrative as he goes along, you know.
Yeah, it's great when, like, and that's why when you were saying about his kind of quaint genericism, it's really on show in that element. But yeah, he does do interesting things with the genre, obviously. So in terms of the story itself as well, so he gets captured, he starts to get tortured. They take his eye, they take his, which hand is it? I think
right hand. I think. It's like right eye, right hand.
No, left hand, right eye is what it is, I think. Yeah. And so then he's sort of, because he's sort of chained to a board basically, or a tree or something. And then he kind of, with all of his strength, kind of uses his people's ability, which is to shift planes. And so he shifts planes and disappears, and then is saved. This is another element as well, which is that thrown in element, like where he's just saved by this like hairy man in the forest. And I love that.
Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like a cartoon mascot character from like the Flintstones or something.
Yeah, like
where
Harry
it's
and the Hendersons or something. Like
it's like me save you, like me. He does that like me language, like he's like.
Which is universal across the multiverse.
Yeah.
Like there's always someone who speaks that language.
Yeah, I loved how goofy and cartoonish that was. It also kind of reminded me of like there's a bit in Jack Vance's Lioness where there's like a similarly goofy, like unidentified furry animal character who gets into all this, like he kind of shows up at one of the wizard characters' houses and makes all this like mischief, trying to be helpful, and it's all very kind of like quaint and A.A. Milne. And then the wizard has to go on some adventure, and when he comes back, like some evil criminals have like broken in and like roasted this animal character to death on a spit, and it's just like completely kind of jarring, and you know, like the tonal shift of it, but it's also not like done in this kind of postmodern way. Like those two sides just uneasily coexist.
Well, I like what Moorcock does with with that kind of character trope there as well, because like he's obviously this benevolent, you know, man in the forest who's there to help him, but he, instead of just helping him, like, Corum is very resistant and tries to, because he wants to go back and kill the dudes who tortured him, the men who tortured him, and then this simple me talking guy just basically pummels him over the head with a rock and then like drags him to the good Mabden, which is pretty funny. I love that. It was kind of like a funny, like, little generic subversion of that character type.
Yeah, and that thing's master. Oh, sorry, you go.
I was just gonna say he gets like wrecked all the time. At least in the first part of the book. Like he's completely like inexperienced, and you know, there are just so many moments where you're like, this bro is doomed. Like, there's no way.
I think he even says
not
that.
Equipped.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say it's also like that 8-man forest nymph guy or whatever. His like master is the brown man or something like that. Like, that's just it's referred to as just the brown man.
Yeah, I love
Who's
that.
some kind of giant or something.
No, there's the forest guy is the brown man of law, and then there's also the giant of law.
Oh, okay, right.
Who then, you know, spoilers, later turns out to have another identity.
But yeah, so he basically gets taken to a castle which is sort of on a causeway. I forget what it was called, but I think that was like a emanation as well of like what's it called? Saint Michel's in France. Is it Saint Michel's?
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be that.
Yeah. But so he's sort of protected there, and then eventually the men come, and he falls in love very quickly with the Margravine, the woman in the castle, which I thought was funny because he's always, Moorcock, in a lot of his interviews, and even just this BBC one I watched just before he came on, which was really good. It was called Time Out of Mind. It's all on YouTube. And so it's got him there with like M. John Harrison, and they're talking about the importance of, like, you know, representing the city, particularly London being a big thing in Moorcock's work. And then but the country's important too. And they're all out like climbing in Yorkshire, which is really funny. Like M. John Harrison and Moorcock just like scaling rocks. But while they're talking about radical politics and stuff like that. But the Margravine I found really funny as well, because she was so, like, Moorcock's always going on about like sexism in fantasy, but she's just like this, oh, Corum, I love you.
Yeah, no, it's like pure male wish fulfillment, where he like wakes up in her bed and she's already like decided that he's in a relationship with her.
Yeah.
No, I like this too. I like that he's like a self-professed feminist, but he just writes the most like plainly kind of like wish fulfillment fantasy scenarios with female characters. Like the Elric books are the same. They're always like these like, you know, women showing up in taverns who like ask Elric to do some favor for them, and then like there's just descriptions of like their wild love play throughout the night and all of this kind of thing, and it's really highfalutin. But like it's funny because like part of his lore is that he was like good friends with Andrea Dworkin as well.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and like she convinced him to like rewrite passages of his books that she found objectionable, apparently, that had like kind of BDSM content.
Oh my god, that's amazing! I didn't know that. Wow. Which did she spend a lot of time over in the UK or something?
I don't know. Because I don't know when they would have met or how. But
because
yeah,
I've seen an amazing. There was this old show that used to be on, I think on the BBC, which was like this. It was really had no format. I think it was called After Dark or something like that. And it was just people just talking. It was probably like proto like podcasts, where it was just a group of people just talking about a topic, and it was really formless, and it usually had like big names. Like, and there was one which was about like feminism or sexual politics or something, and it had Andrea Dworkin and Anthony Burgess.
Oh yeah.
It was so funny to watch this like interaction between them because he's like super chauvinistic and
it's funny that shows back then would actually like as part of their like intellectual diversity that actually like have the explicitly chauvinist misogynistic position like represented. It's kind of like unthinkable now, but they'd actually be like arguing with feminists like as part of like a public debate.
Yeah, I love that. But maybe she spent a lot of time over there and that's how she met Moorcock. Which is very ironic that Andrea Dworkin, given her work, befriended someone called Moorcock, but let's not go there. But yeah, where was it? Yeah, so yeah, he meets the Magravine, and Relina is her name, and eventually the Mabden are on their doorstep and start a siege, and she kind of makes a deal with to sort of kind of save them, and it kind of resurrects her long dead husband who was lost at sea, and there's this like undead like ship of like rotting bodies. I love the description of that, like how the smell, especially like because you see things like Pirates of the Caribbean and things that like do the undead thing, and they never pay enough attention to like how that would smell.
Oh yeah.
And that was really cool. And the idea was that he would the dead husband she would sail with them for eternity or whatever. And Corum kind of stops that, and then they meet very late in the game. They meet the sorcerer. Is the sorcerer the one she made a deal with? I wasn't clear on that, or was it?
I think she thought she was. Oh, you go.
It's the sorcerer.
Sure.
I think the idea is that her dead husband and all his crewmates are under his power, the sorcerer's power, because it's like his seas.
Yes.
And then she summons them it's one of these like things that he hasn't quite like fully shaded it in, which there's a little bit of in the books. But Corum doesn't want to lose her, so he gets on the ship with her, and then they basically sail to the evil wizard's island. What's his name?
Shul, I think his
Shul?
name.
Yeah, Shul.
Who is like the funniest character in this book.
He's fantastic. But then also like all the sort of evil characters or the antagonist characters in this, with the exception of the evil Mabden chief, whose name escapes me right now, they're all kind of like crafty and whimsical. And they'll just randomly do things, and it's sort of characteristic of the kind of like one thing after another tempo of the book and its narrative structure, that like having raised this woman's dead husband and all his men from the ocean, that basically exists to just get them to this wizard's island, and then the wizard is like, oh, I had to break my oath with the woman's husband, or what, I can't remember his name, and now he's no longer bound to me, and he's dead. And that's just like done away with.
It's just done away with. I love it.
Yeah. And that's kind of what he does. Like, it's completely like, it's all about like dazzling you temporarily with some kind of like fantastic event, or it's like, it's very much like spectacle. Just the sense of fantastic spectacle is so key to Moorcock, where again he's just not interested in like tying it too rigidly into some kind of encyclopedia of lore or something. It's just about like getting from A to B, but then making it as sort of like rich and sort of sensorially spectacular as possible. And that's why I think his writing also has this like psychedelic quality,
Yeah, and so he comes to the wizard's island, and the wizard is basically trying to stay one step ahead of like different kind of forces in the universe, and wants to live forever. And one of the ways he does this is like changing bodies and not personalities, but like changing different forms and stuff like that. And he also has to stay on the island, so he sort of tasks Corum with trying to getting the heart of the Knight of the Swords, which is the one of the Chaos gods. Spoilers, but. And so, that's Corum's quest. Very late in the game too. Like he's given a quest, and it's like, it's basically a couple of chapters, I think. And he goes he gets a replacement eye, which is like a jewel, and a replacement hand, which is like a 6-fingered hand. And these are kind of, remnants of a chaos god and a law god fighting. So, which I like that image as well. Him being his sort of tokens that he gets being kind of like opposing forces. That was really cool. But like the wizard himself is so funny because like they're just having conversations and he's trying to convince him to go on this quest. And it's kind of like it's almost slapstick, like, he's like a thin guy at one point, and then he's like a little girl, and then he's like this beast, like, and just like
he shows up and he's like a bear. Yeah. He's like a bear creature, but like wearing a so ridiculous helmet.
Yeah, but it's so funny. Like, it's so funny, and like, it kind of really undermines the trope of the dark necromancer, like being kind of evil and great. And he is kind of grotesque in a kind of whimsical way, though. Like, it's really funny. Like, I was laughing so much.
Like a mustache twirling villain as well, in a kind of like classic mode, which is fun. Because there's also such a sort of just like, H. Rider Haggard, Scarlet Pimpernel, like swashbuckling quality to Moorcock as well. That's that I just adore, and yeah, he's just one of these like sinister villainous characters who's like untrustworthy, but sort of the hero has to temporarily ally with them because they hold all the cards temporarily.
I think queer coded as well.
Yeah,
I mean, sorcerers always kind of are.
Yeah,
like,
I was gonna say all wizards kind of are.
Because that probably goes back to like, how Viking culture, like the sorcerers, male sorcerers were always kind of a little bit viewed as effeminate because that was like woman's work, sorcery and like potions and stuff,
I'm sure there must be like gay relationships within the multiverse as well. That like, I mean, I know that like the Colonel Pyatt character is sort of like supposed to be kind of casually bisexual as well. I think Moorcock was probably, I could imagine that he would be quite sort of like forward thinking about that kind of thing. Even sort of back in the day.
Well, yeah, that's something that I was like reading between the lines when I was like looking at his biography and stuff. I'll just try and find it because so he worked. One thing we'll talk about as well, I think, eventually, is that he worked with he did a lot of music too, like worked with a lot of bands. And one of the front men of Hawkwind, Robert Calvert, who he's worked with on another concept album, he apparently was married to one of his Moorcock's wife, Jill Riches, later married Robert Calvert. So I'm thinking there's some kind of swinging situation going on. And that
I could easily see it. Yeah, I mean, I think he was also like a prodigious drug user. And, like I actually, one of my like a book I'm really proud of having in my collection is this random book I found in like a market stall, which is called, I think it's called like Letters from Hollywood or something like that, which is this Michael Moorcock book about this, which is basically a diary of a time he spent in LA in the 70s. And he actually like lives in Texas. He's not one of these like snooty America hating British people. But he actually loves like 70s LA as well, and he loves all of the kind of he's there to like work on the script for a film. And I think he kind of like hints that it's Star Wars, but it's not. It's like The Land Before Time or something. But he loves like the artifice and the fantasy of LA, and it's like very much in keeping, and it's just written in the same like prose style as his fantasy novels, basically, as well, which is his like usual style. But you know, he talks about like doing cocaine with bikers and all kinds of stuff. So he was kind of like a rock and roll guy, I think. And he definitely, you know, especially also Jerry Cornelius has loads of, you know, I guess stuff that would now be considered queer or like
because it's sort of ambiguous gender or something like that.
Yeah,
kind of a bit of a Bowie sort of thing.
NB Cornelius.
NB Cornelius.
The name is pretty gay, Jerry Cornelius.
Yeah. Sock Cornelius.
Yeah.
So I just found that little tidbit really. It wasn't really explicitly said, but like his ex-wife is married a collaborator. So I'm like, there's some kind of incestuous like network going on there that like
100%. I believe it in a second.
Yeah. But yeah, where were we with the story? Yeah, so basically, Corum is tasked with finding the heart of this chaos god Ariok, and he goes to his castle. That was like, I loved the images in that sequence as well, like this giant corpulent like god with this huge sword, and like people like running up and down him, like cleaning him, and also like
the
trying to get
fleas.
the food scraps. And
he keeps describing them as like human lice or like Mabden lice.
Yeah, it was kind of disgusting, but I loved it.
It's a very like kind of berserk image, you know, like that's really cool. The introduction of Ariok, if you're like an Elric reader, that's when you're like, like, you know, and you see what he's done here, because Ariok is the god that Elric is always like calling on when he's in a tight spot. Like if, you know, he's outnumbered or weak or something, then that's when he'll like chant a spell to Ariok for assistance. And so this is like, you know, one of these kind of neat things where you get like another universe's like perspective on this character and his sort of particular reputation amongst the people who inhabit that universe.
So that's where you see the symbol as well, the Discordian, the symbol that the Discordians adopted anyway.
It's like on the door to the room to where with the heart.
Where his heart is,
That's very video gamey, you know.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. It's kind of it reminded me of Doom, you know, like
I was just playing like Doom 64 earlier today, and it's just like, you know, glyphs on all the walls and stuff, and
and you know there's going to be something really something either really good or really like hard to beat in there, you know.
And the fact that like everything in Ariok's palace as well is always just like emitting light, you know. Everything is kind of glowing or shimmering, or like there's this great sense of detail that you get with Moorcock, especially with like materials, whether it's like clothing. There's one like passage early in the book that's really funny where he's describing what this like rabble of barbarian Mabden, what clothes they're wearing, and part of his like workman-like approach to narrative is that like whenever he introduces new characters, he'll just like systematically go through and describe like what clothes they're wearing, what weapons they're carrying, what vehicles are they using, and any other like details that he thinks might be important. But there's one passage where like he's just like relentlessly describing all the different types of animal skins that these like barbarians are wearing, and he's like, you know, he's just going through like every variation of clothing, and it's like bear skin, rabbit skin, doe skin, sheep skin,
seal skin jerkin, pig skin
seal
boots.
skin. And there's all these like fantasy clothing words like jerkin as well that you can't like really visualize what exactly they are, or at least I can't.
I think they're like a little vest thing.
Yeah, that's
like
what I imagine a jerkin.
Yeah,
It reminds me of like Peep Show when Jeremy's trying to like jerk it to Mark's like video game magazine, and he's like, "Oh, please take off my jerkin, Hopkins."
He's like, "What if she's like an elf that slays hobbits?" But yeah, I also
Moorcock's Jerkin.
I also like it whenever he's describing jewelry. You know, and it doesn't. There aren't that many good jewelry passages in this book. There are a few, but like just across his writing in general, you know, he's always like describing characters wearing like rings that are like sapphires and emeralds, and you know, just like huge variety of precious stones that he seems to have memorized. And everything is always like really multicolored, you know, everything is always like red and green and blue, or like a character will be described as wearing like black and silver armor. And it's all just like extremely kind of like this has this kind of like pastel children's illustration texture to it that I think is really lovely.
Yeah, it's very like it just like invokes this like memory I have of just being young in like the like early 90s, and just like even like shows like Gumby and just like any kind of like sword and sorcery movie or something. They always were just very like crystalline kind of palaces and like shining stones and like black and white checkered floors and things like that. And this book was just like totally just like
it's
invoking
exactly
that
like
vibe.
That.
Yeah, like it's never-ending story. That's when you're saying that. That's what I'm imagining. The sort of images and
like He-Man.
Yes, He-Man.
You know,
Conan
just that
movies.
Yeah, just that particular kind of like texture of like where or things like Ralph Bakshi's Wizards.
Yes.
Everything just has this kind of like sparkling, vivid sheen to it. That isn't really like. Again, it's not in this George R. R. Martin way, like, you know, none of this works in a realist sense, where it's like, how exactly, like, if you try and focus in on, like, you know, he enters Ariok's palace, and Ariok is like this, you know, the size of a castle, but he'll, like, pick Corum up, and then drop Corum, but it's not clear like what distance Corum has fallen to the floor, and he'll just be described as like getting up, you know, and like even though it's this like vast cavernous space, the sort of like narrative time it takes Corum to like exit, you know, is like nothing. So if you try and like keep the like sense of space of some of these environments consistent, as if it were like describing a real location, the whole thing just kind of begins to not fall apart, but it begins to sort of like creak a little bit, you know?
Yeah. And that's something that I mean, I think we talked about this I think it was on the John Crowley episode where we M. John Harrison was very much against too this like that kind of world building tendency in a lot of science fiction and fantasy writers where like every inch of the space must be like completely described and like in order for people to imagine, to step into the imaginative space. But I'm like, and he's right that like that gets it sort of arse about is that actually you don't need to go into like consistent you know, detail in order for people to put themselves in those sorts of spaces, that people can imagine it, you know, and you don't need to like, I don't need to know how many meters the throne room was, you know,
well,
like.
Have you ever read Dante's Inferno? And then there's all these notes where it's like, well, we've tried to, but we can't make any sense of like these measurements actually adding up. And I'm just like, who gives a shit? Like, I'm not reading it to like have like a, you know, to the millimeter map of the rings of hell kind of thing. It's like poetry that's invoking this thing. Like I wasn't thinking about like, oh, that doesn't add up at all.
But the
Yeah,
thing that I don't like about it is it doesn't trust people's imaginations to like fill in the details, you know?
Well, you'll have like Ariok walking Corum down a corridor with walls of cascading marble, and you know, like you're just kind of like, what? Why does the corridor have walls of cascading marble? Like what? You know, and it's just like because it looks cool. Like it looks, it looks pretty. It looks like, you know, it just sounds like appealing. It's pleasurable to read. The images that like cast up to the mind's eye are kind of like exotic and fantastic, and that's what you want from a work of fantasy.
And cascading's a nice word, you know, like
Yeah.
it's just fun to read. Like I remember reading when I was a teenager, I got into like fantasy for a bit. Like I read like Lord of the Rings and then the Belgariad by David Eddings. And then I thought, oh, I'm really into fantasy. And then I could just never find another fantasy book I liked. I remember reading this book by Cecilia Dart Thornton. I think she's an Australian fantasy author.
She is. Yeah.
It was unbearable. Like it was just like a whole chapter was basically describing the walls of a dungeon or something. It was just detail I just didn't need to go into, and I just kept being like, "Oh, surely it's going to get good eventually." And I just gave up like 3 chapters in. I was just like, "I can't do this. It's just all description." Like there needs to be like a balance to a degree, you know. Like yeah, you want some idea of what it looks like, but I don't need what every pebble is like.
Exactly. Yeah. So like that's the thing which is funny that these genres as well are in some senses have the capacity for maximal imagination, but like it's almost like a lot of these writers try to contain it by making things like this is exactly what it looked like and imagine it this way. It's very like it can be very browbeating to read a style like that, but Moorcock really isn't like that, and like
he just doesn't give a shit.
Like, it's like slapdash kind of. It's inconsistent. Yeah. It's this is pretty, that's pretty. Like this looked like this. This is how it felt, smelled, and that's all you really need, I think.
Every now and again, you know, it varies from book to book, and it depends on how like literary he's being. But there are like, you know, you might find occasionally that there's a bit of like detail slippage where something isn't fully consistent from paragraph to paragraph, and it's just kind of made it in past the editor. But again, it's just part of the sort of like texture of Moorcock, you know.
And you can imagine in his universe, like it could be like auto-corrected by it's like, well, this is kind of like a shifting world where it doesn't always have definite form. So like anything that didn't like fully line up, you could just, that's perception, that's a different dimension, or it's just, this world, the chaos of it is like allowing for things that are like not meshing completely to sort of mesh.
Yeah, that's something, and that's something like that of, you know, fantasy and science fiction fans just automatically do. Like there are so many like fan theory like videos and stuff like that basically try to not paper over, but like correct inconsistencies by using like, you know, the magical or science fictional elements of the world to justify the inconsistency. Whereas like, I just like that he doesn't care about that.
No,
like,
he does a bit of that internally where he's like, he makes things consistent across the multiverse, but it doesn't really affect the like texture of an individual book, you know. But yeah, it can be really suffocating. You get this a lot with like American comics, I think, as well, where things that were sort of like extra textual artifacts of the medium, over time, some clever like fan turned writer will show up and take it upon himself to sort of like provide an in-universe explanation for something that previously was just a sort of like textual quality, like a certain narrative rhythm or something. Even like The Simpsons is doing this now, where there'll be like a barfly character, but there'll be like a special episode about his life where the characters realize that they never paid attention to him. And it's like, before that was just like part of the text, that there was like a background character to add a sense of like lived-inness to the environment. But now we're too clever for that, and we have to like, you know, horribly, suffocatingly delineate in detail, like the grain of like Homer's particular relationship to like Larry the barfly, and it's like, who fucking cares? But it also like, ironically, it's actually more kind of delusional and sort of like Christian brained than just having him be in the background, because it's about reinforcing this like delusion in the viewer that you are the main character, and that like, if you were in the background of someone else's life in a bar, you would still assume like cosmic importance, and have like a ball episode dedicated to you, and like where all the characters feel bad that they all took you for granted and all of this kind of thing. Whereas like the actual experience of life is that you go out in the world and there are other people and you don't know them intimately, but you still share a space with them. And that's actually like what it's like to be a human being in a society, So it's actually like kind of less realist. It's like a vulgar idea of verisimilitude.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, in the story itself, Corum basically almost gets eaten by Ariok, but then he has the very, I think, obvious idea to destroy the heart. And then basically, I love that description of Ariok just like melting away, like his flesh just sort of dissipating. That was kind of disgusting. I love that.
And Ariok's just like indifferent to him there. He's like, oh,
Yeah.
you're some foreigner here. Okay, yeah, whatever. I'll show you around the castle. And then like doesn't like seem to actually hold any malice towards him or anything like that. And then I guess you find out it is part of the plan. Like he needs Corum to like actually bring the heart to him or whatever, so he can like fully take power over the dimensions or something like that.
And that also ends up, once he defeats Ariok and goes back to the Wizard's Island, that also ends up like weakening the wizard because he was drawing his power from the god, which that was a really funny moment. That's
so cool. I love that kind of whole like conspiratorial quality to it, where I love the kind of like, this is where, having talked about how like workman-like and pulpy the whole book is, this is where it gets kind of sophisticated, because there are these like multiple levels of irony where the wizard Shul gives Corum this task to steal Ariok's heart to increase his own power against Ariok, but then it transpires that Ariok is actually like responsible for the power that the wizard has in the first place. The wizard believes that he's acquired it through his own learning and study of magic or whatever, but we understand that actually this is like, like a sort of Ariok taking advantage of the wizard's own like arrogance or whatever. And the key thing is that like Ariok has done this partly, as part of a plot to gain control of his own heart, so that he has access to, other dimensions. I mean, this also has a kind of very kind of like 80s kids TV Care Bears feel to it, like, but also just kind of because he's like bored,
Yeah.
And this is where this whole like kind of fin de siècle theme comes in, and where the sort of like existentialist concern comes in, because you get this sense of even though it's set like at the dawn of humanity, we get the sense that this is kind of like a universe that's winding down, and everybody is caught up in this general malaise, and the lower level characters like Corum or the human beings assume that the gods are, engaging in some kind of like operatic cosmic struggle, but actually they too are kind of victims of this malaise and are sort of bored and toying with people for their amusement. And the sort of parallels between the what are they called? Not the Nadrag, but the one that
The
Corum
Vardog.
is. The Vardog. Like the Vardog and Corum himself, and then Shul, and then Ariok are all in roughly the same kind of condition of like decadent lounging around at various times. You know, and there's there's this kind of thing, like even at the beginning where Corum's dad tells him to go on this quest to visit the other Vadag castles. Corum still like waits 2 days before doing it because he's just got kind of time to kill, like, and
Yeah.
he's just led this life of contemplation and study. So
he's literally me. It takes me days to do anything.
Yeah,
it's
same.
like, oh yeah, I've got to do that.
It's like the most relatable thing about him as a hero, you know, like
Yeah.
that he
And it's like the
doesn't,
Mabden are the only ones with any kind of like vitality, really, because at least they're trying to like usurp and conquer, and like they're on the rise, where everyone else, is in this like state of decadence and just, all bored and just engaging in sort of pointless abstractions.
The barbarians are at the gate. You know,
well, that's the way that
yeah.
the Mabden chief, you know, who is a kind of great like villain because you really hate him, but like there are these kind of sympathetic notes that are given to him with his like little page boy handing him his axe or whatever. But you know, also he actually, as you said, he's like one of the few characters who really has a kind of drive, but also who seems to kind of like relish life in some way, who seems to like enjoy the thrill of, you know, conquest or whatever, and sort of essentially sees the world as up for grabs and has this kind of disgust for the Vadag or however you say it, because they've kind of retreated into their castles, and there's something of this kind of like contempt that he has for them, for that, because they're sort of turning away from life.
So it's funny that you say it gets sophisticated with, you know, Shul's power being kind of basically dissipated by the death of the god, because I kind of read that as a bit of a workmanlike thing as well, because it was like, oh shit, like I'm just imagining him writing it and being like, oh shit, how do I deal with the sorcerer now? It's like, I know, like it could have been that as well, while at the same time being like really sophisticated.
Oh yeah, I mean, he never really leaves that level of things.
Yeah,
you know, like it's always like a neat wrap up, and like the way that Corum just crushes the heart is it is very sort of Deus Ex Machina ish. You know, like it's very just like there's no real reason to stop him from doing that as soon as he has it.
Yeah,
you know, like but you can't fuss about these things, like you know.
Well, it's like I guess he thought like he needed to bring the heart back to Shul to get Relina back.
Oh, that's right.
But then he's like, oh no, I've been played for a pawn here. Like I'm going to be just handing it to this god to make him even more powerful. So, well, I guess I'll just like stomp it or whatever.
No, but wasn't it the hand that did it? Because the hand was was the I think
it has its own agency.
That belongs to it has its own agency, and that belongs to a god of law. So like it basically got hold of the heart and just wanted to kill it because that's
the hand. Another like Elric resonance is the hand just randomly killing people of its own volition. Yeah. Like his cool Mabden friend with his magic kite.
Oh, yeah.
Who gets his eyes gouged out, or like his, you know, and Corum has like the guy's brains on his fingers. It's really gross.
That guy was so nice too.
Yeah,
Poor
it sucks because Corum is such a, you know, moody bitch. Like he really needs a kind of jovial friend, and that's another like Moorcock dynamic. Like, you know, Elric has Moonglum. There always has to be like a little dirty man who hangs out with the moody hero, the moody Byronic hero, and like makes jokes, you know, but also falls appropriately silent at serious times.
Yeah. So it all wraps up really neatly. I haven't read the other ones, but we should make like a series of this. It looks really. I don't know where it's going to go next, but it was like a nice rollicking kind of adventure. Very yeah, very pulpy, while at the same time like adding a little bit extra to it, in the sense of irony and sarcasm in it was really fun. And one of the things you said, you had the second series, Yerk. One of the things that I was a nice touch in this was the almost Celtic resonances, like
Yeah.
the names sounded vaguely Celtic and Welsh or Irish, because they've got those names that a lot of the humans, especially like Mabden, just sounds like something out of the Welsh folk tales or whatever. But like, yeah, so the language, but in the second series, it gets much more direct in its kind of Celtic sort of influences, doesn't it?
It shows how like how kind of formulaic all these books are, and I mean that this term, which is usually negative, I mean it in a positive sense, but like because what he does is he kind of has like Corum kind of isekai into the future, which is essentially, for all intents and purposes, just like a different universe, which has a kind of like Celtic vibe to it. I mean, as much as like those like names like Mabden have a flavor of that, which is intentional, they're also like sharing a sort of universe with like Ariok and like weird beings who have like circular mouths and eyes and all of this other, mishmash of fantasy images. But then the second series, he loses the hand that he gets given, like the god hand thing, and he gets given like a silver hand, and he basically becomes like a canonical hero from like Celtic mythology, and I can't remember his name, but there is like a guy in Celtic myth who has like a silver hand, and all of the like names of things are kind of borrowed from this, so it just becomes like a Moorcockian retelling of these myths. So essentially it's just like the Moorcock narrative, but with like a kind of Celtic skin, and it's just sort of like, it reflects the kind of interchangeability of the formula, that he can just take Corum and like swap him from one kind of fantasy aesthetic into another one. And then there is some kind of like fictional connective tissue that links the universes. But
that's always been a thing with like this kind of story as well. Not even just with the multiverse thing. Like Conan's stories did that as well. Like, you have this like giant kind of world that is sort of the world before time, a prehistorical kind of fantasy land, and like in one story, Conan is like, fighting this Orientalist cult of like snake worshippers, and in the next he's like in like this ancient Rome pastiche. Like, so yeah, it's the freedom of the form, I think, because you can literally do anything. I think that's partially what he does.
Yeah.
I just like that it has the Celtic skin flavor, because it's something that
it's really cool. Like, there's the Green Man and like the Foymore, there's like sea peoples and all of this kind of stuff. It's nice how he like draws on all of that lore. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's all right, because it's like, it's funny because a lot of fantasy is drawn from a lot of these things and doesn't necessarily, I feel like lots of people authors don't even know that they're drawing on some of these things, but it's definitely been influenced by a lot of the Celtic myths and stuff. One really good series that I absolutely loved when I was young was the Stephen Lawhead ones. Did you read those?
I haven't heard of him.
So I think he's a British author, but he basically retold the Arthurian myth, but he kind of connected it to a whole heap of other Celtic stuffs as well, and and Atlantis. So like the first the first book is about the Welsh warrior poet Taliesin, and he's like a refugee from Atlantis who like lands in Wales or something. And then Taliesin, I don't know if he's related or not, or if he's just the teacher of Merlin. And then there's a Merlin book, and then it goes on like Arthur, and like it just goes on into like, kind of gets more historical the more it goes on, which I really like that sort of stuff.
That's cool.
On the Celtic thing too, like, because I just was like looking on Amazon or whatever for the other Corum books, and it just said like free with membership. I could like get the audio book for the Knight of Swords, this first Corum book, and it's sort of like an audio play thing, and then like Corum and that is given. Like I just started listening to it this morning just to like refresh. But yeah, Corum and that is given like Scottish accents.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So anyone out there listening, if you got an Amazon account or Audible or whatever, you can probably just listen to this for free. It's like 5 hours or something.
Wow.
The thing that's fun about it though as well is it's not like particularly worthy about it as well. It just kind of just takes it as like material to be like recycled into the Moorcockian narrative. But yeah, it's really really great. I wanted to bring up his Dances at the End of Time series.
Yeah.
Which is this kind of it's like sort of like almost in this sort of Douglas Adams mode slightly, because he kind of wrote it as like a tribute to his fantasy siècle enthusiasms, but it's also written in this kind of P.G. Wodehouse pastiche. But the premise is that it's sort of set is these people who live at the end of time, and they have these kind of like power rings that can generate anything. So they have like infinite resources, but they can also just kind of like create anything they imagine at any time, like whether it's food or, and they're also all immortal, because if one of them dies, they can instantly be resurrected with one of the rings. So they live in this kind of like totally like post-scarcity endless playground existence, where nothing has any stakes. And then that's where the character Yeerk Carnelian comes from, and he has to go back in time to, I can't remember why, to like Victorian Britain, where he like meets a kind of prim and proper Victorian lady and has a sort of romance with her. But there's this kind of like implication that Moorcock flirts with, that like the Dancers at the End of Time, these characters are actually like the Lords of Chaos, or incarnation of them, and it's just like another angle of this kind of theme of like decadence, because this is like, it's decadence in its most kind of like fantasy siècle, like there's nothing to do, we're just gonna live for pleasure and enjoy like pleasurable sights and sensations and all of this kind of thing. But they're also kind of like sympathetic and comedic characters. And it's just a sort of example of how, like, there's one, bonus story that's set in the Dances at the End of Time world where like Elric falls through a portal and they like kind of put on a show for him with monsters to kill or whatever. And from his point of view, these are all like illusions of the Lords of Chaos kind of thing. So there's just this kind of idea that like these forces, which are really like sinister and dark and evil in one book, are kind of like whimsical and harmless in another one. And it's all just part of this kind of like passing the time. It's like cosmic passing the time, basically.
I liked the overall kind of philosophy of, chaos is often, I think in this book, was associated with evil and law associated with good, but it's like way more complex than that, because I think even in the Corum book that we read, I think there's even like a reference to chaos being the generative side of things. Like creation needs chaos to kind of, things need to sort of be generated.
It's like a balance.
Yeah.
Like, because otherwise, if you have pure order, then like it's like this thing. Like, there'd be no time or something like that. It'd just be like everything's solid and fixed.
Yeah, and
I mean, it's all really like. Sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that like. And so that I haven't read Dance at the End of Time, but that idea that they just create things, but like if they're the Lords of Chaos, if that's indeed what they're supposed to be, the malaise is you create things, but you have no ordering principle within which to create them. So like there's a kind of malaise there that like you just like it's all about sensuousness and and that's pretty much like what decadence is, right? Isn't it? It's like the creative energies of a society or culture that just they don't really go anywhere, or
they're just like exhausting themselves. They don't have a purpose.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, the correct way to see the sort of Moorcockian cosmology is really just as an allegory of his own like creative process, where, each book is a particular recipe of like order and chaos on a textual level.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is also true of like a writer who's kind of different, like Richard Brautigan. But like one thing they have in common is that they're both in love with this, I think like the freedom and exuberance of imaginative production, just imagining things, and I think, Moorcock was somebody who's never shy about like writing for money, which is also why I think he's like appealing. But I think that like his love of fantasy is to do with this sense of like exuberance and like ex nihilo creation. And I think that's what like that workman-like quality, that what makes it cool is that you can really tell, you can sense the like enthusiasm that's even at his most kind of like pulpy and tossed off, there's still this kind of like love of creativity and love of like imagination and vibrancy that's kind of being worked through.
Yeah, definitely. Like I think it was either David or Kelby from Agitator, I can't remember who, said that like the way that something is written, when you read it, you can feel it. So what the writer was feeling when and you can tell that he's just always exuberant about this. Like he's like, oh, then here's a giant bat. Isn't that cool? Like, we didn't mention the giant bat, which was great. I love the giant bat.
Another thing that is like of no consequence.
just tossed off. Yeah.
And it's not like there's no like bat theme to the people who live in that particular castle or anything. Like, a more like lore obsessed writer would be like, the bat people of Bat Castle who are obsessed with bats, and they have some
symbol
kind of
is the bat.
symbol is the bat.
But then he anticipates the nerds who will like when the castle is being besieged of the people who ride the bats. He anticipates the nerds by saying, "Oh, it's winter and the bats are hibernating, and you can't wake them up." And so, like, he just like he even tosses off like anticipated like critiques or like nerdish sort of like, "Oh, but why don't they just fly away on the bats?"
It's literally like a bit of a video game level that's like powered down, like and not in operation, because he's like the bats. They're not like they've played their part in the plot, which was to like have a cool way to have Corum be pulled out of the sea, and like that's what their narrative purpose is. So now they're done. They're just like in the caves now, hibernating.
It's not like the people had like great control over them. They were like sort of able to just wrangle them a little bit, but it was still very like, sketchy.
Well, it's a very like Daniel Defoe like thing, where like if you read Robinson Crusoe, like Daniel Defoe is always like putting Crusoe in these situations, and then like realizing like what one of the consequences of that situation might be 3 paragraphs too late, and then going like, oh, like I just keep bringing up this anecdote, but like, he'll just be like, oh yeah, I brought this thing up earlier. I forgot to say, but da 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 da. you know, and it's this very like kind of problem solving, like sentence by sentence problem solving approach to writing, where he like does keep track of all of this kind of stuff, and you know, he anticipates these like little, you know, comic book guy.
Yeah, it's also like it harks back to like oral storytelling as well, because it's like, you know, you're standing there telling a story around a campfire, and then someone pipes up and is like, "Yeah, but what about this?" And they're like, "Well, I forgot to mention."
Yeah, that doesn't work in the springtime. I'm sorry.
The bats were hibernating, in fact. So, you know.
Yeah, I love it. All right. Yeah, that was great. We should do another couple of episodes on this series because I love it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
We could probably do the next 2 books in one episode or something.
Yeah, definitely.
Sure.
Yeerk, I know you've mentioned this before, but where can people find you?
I need to go to my profile to like check.
Well, the podcast is Bistro Californium.
Thank you. Yes. I never have like the actual like URL to hand. Let me just
that's all right.
Get it up. But you can find me on Twitter at @pyeerk, and the podcast is Bistro Californium, patreon.com/Bistro Californium. That's Californium as an element, not like California.
The state.
Yeah. I probably made that more confusing, but
IUM on the end.
Yes. IUM on the end.
Wonderful. Thanks for your Moorcockian exuberance talking about these books. And go check out Yeerk's podcast. It's really great.
It's tough stuff.
I recently listened to the one you did with Josh about The King and I and South Pacific, and that was lovely. I love
doing that so much. I think that's like the best I've ever been on a show so far. So I would definitely check out that one. And Josh is such a like lovely conversationalist. I've actually got like part 2 of that with him again talking about Carousel and Oklahoma in editing purgatory right now.
Amazing.
So, yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us tonight. How much do you have an extra time, or do you want to get
sure,
away
man?
To
yeah.
No, we might do like a kind of free form, back matter, kind of in the spirit of Moorcock. We'll just like do it on the fly. I don't have any topics or anything, but
we can vamp.
Yeah, we can vamp. All right. All right. If you're interested in that, go to patreon.com/gettinglit. That'll be in the Patreon. Until then, we'll see you next time. Bye.